Big Frankie Cocchiaro was born on October 29, 1920 in the Upper Manhattan section of East Harlem. He was raised in Brooklyn. His parents were listed as Rosario and Francis Cocchiaro of Brooklyn, both of whom were born back in Ribera, Sicily, the hometown of most of the original members of the DeCavalcante crew. Frank had a younger brother named Carmelo, also known as Emilio, who followed Frank into the rackets. They had another brother named Joseph who committed suicide in 1952 at the age of 22. In 1938, when Frank was 18 years old, he married and moved to an apartment in Brooklyn. He later resided with his wife in the Jackson Heights section of Queens. After separating from his wife in 1950, Frank moved back to Brooklyn for a while. But as of 1959, he was back living in an apartment in the Astoria section of Queens. Frank Cocchiaro got married a second time and was also known to keep several paramours stashed in apartments he paid for around New York City. He shared one of these apartments with a common-law wife in Brooklyn, and Frank alternately stayed at other addresses from time to time in such places as Manhattan. Frank Cocchiaro stood a little over 6 feet tall and weighed 210 pounds. He had dark brown hair and eyes and was a nice-looking guy who fancied himself a ladies' man. In fact, it was his large frame that produced one of his mob nicknames, Big Frankie. Big Frankie was known as a flashy hoodlum who liked to drive late-model Cadillacs and frequent the best nightclubs such as the Copacabana in Midtown Manhattan. He was also said to have been an avid golf enthusiast who often awoke at 5 a.m. for a round of golf at a local course and would then go back to sleep for the rest of the day until he got dressed to go nightclubbing and conduct mob business in the nighttime. Among the more popular hangouts of Cocchiaro were the Rumpus Room, the Sapphire Room, and the Orchid Room, all of Jackson Heights, Queens. When in Brooklyn, he liked to wet his whistle at the Barge Restaurant and Lounge in the Sheepshead Bay section. Another favorite Brooklyn eatery was the famed Monty's Venetian Room in the Red Hook section. Cocchiaro also hung out at a notorious mob social club run by future soldier Rudy Farone known as the Oceanside Boys Club in South Brooklyn. When visiting New Jersey, he had been known to frequent DiMartino's Lounge in Elizabeth, which was another known mob hangout. In the early 1950s, Cocchiaro listed his employment as a bartender at Jean's Bar on Mermaid Avenue in the Coney Island section, but authorities suspected he actually may have held a hidden interest in this licensed establishment. Before I continue, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Frank Cocchiaro started off in the mid-1940s as a young hoodlum operating along the Brooklyn docks as a checker on the piers. But he augmented this income with his work as a cat burglar who specialized in robbing lofts and warehouses of their merchandise. By the mid-1950s, he was a member of a highly publicized bank robbery gang that pulled off a major robbery of a Chase Manhattan bank in Woodside, Queens. After an all-points bulletin for his arrest was splashed across city newspapers, he was arrested in conjunction with this robbery and released on a bail of $50,000. By this time, both local and federal law enforcement authorities started taking a closer look at Frank Cocchiaro. He was already known as a local racketeer, but after the FBI had placed a listening device in the New Jersey office of boss Sam DeCavalcante in early 1964, they soon learned the true status of Big Frankie from Brooklyn. The bug revealed that Frank Cocchiaro was actually an inducted member of the Mafia, serving as a capo regime no less in the DeCavalcante family. In fact, Frank Cocchiaro was a top associate of the boss and a leader of one of two New York factions of the Brigada. And upon learning of Cocchiaro's true status, the FBI pulled out all stops in their efforts to nail Big Frankie Cocchiaro. Frank Cocchiaro had many close associates in the New Jersey and New York City underworld, including DeCavalcante bigwigs Frank Majuri, Sam DeCavalcante, and John Riggi, as well as Anthony Tony Casella, who was a known Brooklyn hood and close associate of Cocchiaro, active in fencing stolen goods, thefts, and the black market. Other associates included Colombo hood Dominick Scialo and his close associate Albert Mugnolo, who was arrested with Scialo for arson and insurance fraud, which Cocchiaro was suspected of being involved with as well. Plus, he was close to Larry Gallo, the notorious brother of the equally notorious Joe Gallo. Cocchiaro was also friendly with Genovese family members Frank Funzi Tieri, Angelo Pero, and Tommy Lombardi. In addition, Frank had a small personal crew of 1960s-era recruits that included Robert DiBernardo, Corky Vastola, Angelo and Umberto Gallo, Rudy Farone, Jimmy Rotondo, and Louis Talisi. All but DiBernardo would later be inducted into the DeCavalcante regime. DiBernardo later jumped to the Gambino family. By the late 1950s, Frank Cocchiaro was operating as a bookmaker in the policy rackets and floating crap games as a Shylock in the Queens, Brooklyn, and northern New Jersey areas. He was also known to engage in burglary, payroll and bank robberies, hijacking, fur and jewel heists, safe jobs, theft and sale of firearms, counterfeiting, strong-arm work, and extortion. As if that wasn't already enough, Big Frank was also allegedly partners in an illegal alcohol still based in New Jersey. In later years, he involved himself in business frauds and narcotics trafficking. Cocchiaro quickly gained the reputation as a guy who would do anything and everything to generate a dollar. Back in 1957, a federal informant told his handlers that Cocchiaro had 2 or 3 swag drops to stash stolen truckloads of merchandise that had been hijacked. In the early 1960s, informants also reported that Cocchiaro may have been involved in a gangland murder. The identity of the victim was never revealed, but it was suspected to have been Alfonso Colicchio, a tavern owner and small-time hood found shot to death in Elizabeth back in 1961. In November 1962, Cocchiaro was allegedly involved in a dispute that turned violent. He was said to have been shot at on the corner of 5th Avenue and Furst Street in South Brooklyn, but police were never called. This locale was just a few blocks down from where Big Frankie was said to be partnered in a blackjack game with several Profaci members out of a social club at 3rd Street and 5th Avenue. In June 1949, Cocchiaro was arrested by the FBI and charged with possessing and transporting $15,000 worth of forged American Express money orders from New York to New Jersey. He was held in lieu of $25,000 bail. In 1950, Cocchiaro was convicted on 2 counts of passing stolen money orders and received 3 years probation. As stated earlier, in the mid-1950s, he was investigated and later charged in the highly publicized Woodside, Queens bank robbery that netted several $100,000. It was a major haul, especially for that era, circa 1955. Charged with him were a ragtag group of hoods, among them several members of what was notoriously known as the Arsenal Mob or the Irish Mob of Manhattan's West Side docks, led by Irish mob boss Eddie McGrath. By the late 1950s, Frank Cocchiaro had become a formally inducted soldier in the family under then-boss Nicky Delmore of Elizabeth, New Jersey. But Cocchiaro was mostly active in the Brooklyn and Queens sections of New York City at that time. He interacted with many varied Queens hoodlums from different crews, but also fellow regime soldiers such as the Giacobbe brothers of Astoria, especially Lenny and Joseph Uncle Joe Giacobbe, Virgil Alessi, and Larry Sharrow. He was also known to be very friendly with Tony Carubia and Big Tony Vanilla. The 2 Tonys were hair-trigger Gambino soldiers who also lived and operated out of that same Queens neighborhood. By the mid-1960s, Cocchiaro had gone partners with his boss Sam DeCavalcante and several of their mob associates in the Imperial Air Conditioning and Refrigeration Company, a service and repair firm located in Kenilworth, New Jersey. Cocchiaro was listed as president, Bernie Furst as secretary, and soldier Robert Bobby Basile Occhipinti as treasurer. Sam, of course, was a hidden partner. Always the nomad, by the late 1960s, the FBI recorded that Frankie had relocated again. He had moved to New Jersey where he was living at the Tivoli Gardens apartments in Long Branch. By this point, Frankie had already been bumped up to a Capo di Decina post. It was around this time that the FBI and the local strike forces were applying renewed pressure on mob families across the region. Cocchiaro was repeatedly called before a state grand jury in New Jersey. After repeatedly pleading the Fifth Amendment while being grilled in the witness chair, the jury panel paused for a coffee break. Cocchiaro stepped outside the courthouse building telling everyone he was going out to smoke a cigarette, but Frank never returned after the 15-minute recess was over. He immediately took it on the hop, going on the lam to avoid what surely looked like an impending contempt of court citation for his refusal to speak to investigators. He flew down to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where he rented an apartment under an assumed name. He also had a set of phony identification papers made for himself to help him avoid the authorities. Frank Cocchiaro lived down in South Florida quietly for over 3 years, until one fateful afternoon in 1972 when he was driving to rent a car in Miami and had a slight fender bender with another automobile who blew a stop sign and hit Big Frank's car. The other driver insisted on calling a cop. When the cop arrived and asked Cocchiaro for his license, Big Frank had 3 and 2 different names, one under his true name of Frank Cocchiaro of Jackson Heights, New York, a chauffeur's license under the name of Frank Anthony Pagnotta of Brooklyn, New York, and a Florida permit also under the name of Frank Pagnotta. It immediately raised a red flag to the Florida policemen, especially when Big Frank gave an evasive explanation about why he had so many different licenses. Soon, authorities realized who they had in front of them. The slippery 52-year-old mafioso was immediately arrested and detained and was soon hauled back to New Jersey to face the music. He ended up being sentenced to 1 year at the Mercer County Correctional Center, and to think, Big Frank wasn't even going to get a ticket for the accident. A few years later, Frank decided to permanently relocate to Florida, as had his boss Sam DeCavalcante and other members of their brigada several years earlier. As a capo, Frank continued overseeing his crew along with his brother Melio and Melio's son Rosario Russ Cocchiaro, who had also relocated down to the Sunshine State. Within a few years' time, the Cocchiaro regime was firmly entrenched in the South Florida underworld. They were operating a large loan sharking operation, gambling, and other rackets. Frank was also suspected of dealing in narcotics. They ran wild for a few years, making good money, until 1981 when the FBI finally caught up with them. The entire Cocchiaro crew was indicted on RICO charges, which included conspiracy, extortion, fraud, usury, gambling, narcotics violations, and the usual. Former Detroit Tigers pitcher Denny McLain was also indicted in this highly publicized case. All defendants were convicted after trial and received lengthy jail sentences. Frank got slammed with a 20-year prison term and was immediately remanded to prison while filing his appeal. Other DeCavalcante soldiers and associates would quickly step into the void left by Frankie, his brother Melio, and their crew members to continue operating in Florida. But for the Cocchiaros, it was all over. Frank never hit the street again. In November 1985, Big Frankie Cocchiaro died while still behind prison walls serving out his sentence. He was only 65 years old. You can read our bio on Frank's brother Carmelo and other intriguing mafia stories on the Button Guys website at www.thenewyorkmafia.com. And please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave us a comment. Thank you for watching. Until next time.